Everyone up here had two stories, the life before and the life now. If you wanted to pray to a weirdo god, or live in a school bus, or marry a goose, no one in Alaska was going to say crap to you. No one cared if you had an old car or a rusted fridge. Any life that could be imagined could be lived up here. End quote. The Great Alone is a story that takes place in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. Initially, Kristin Hannah wrote this book as a thriller with the same characters, but then it ended up being a beautiful coming-of-age novel about a girl trying to find her way, even when everything is against her. This novel is different from Hannah's other historical pieces. While this book takes place in the past, the time period doesn't become a part of the plot. Instead, it stays in the setting like it should. So let's dive into the plot, characters, and themes of the novel The Great Alone. This is a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story. So the central conflict of this novel is about Lenny learning what it means to be a woman. The setting also plays a main role in the central conflict, since surviving in Alaska gives Lenny an additional challenge to growing up, because not only is she figuring out who she is, she's also figuring out how to survive in a difficult climate. The last conflict of the novel centralizes around her father and how he's not dealing with his PTSD after the war and his radicalization through their neighbor. Lenny has a number of challenges throughout this novel, and her mother is there to support her throughout all of them. In the beginning of the novel, we meet the Albright family. Lenny's father, Ernst, and her mother, Cora, or Caroline, had Lenny in a oopsie and decided to get married. Their early life was happy, but Ernst was not the same after returning home from Vietnam. In Vietnam, Ernst made friends with a fellow soldier who was KIA and left him a property in Alaska. Because the family is struggling to make ends meet, they decide to move to Alaska to live on this property. When they get there, everything seems fine, until the family keeps moving further and further away from civilization, and they realize that their property is on a remote island that has very little access to people, and that the life that they had been living is not this life. Most of the people in this small corner of Alaska survive by roughing it and helping each other out. But for the most part, it can be very isolating. The town helps the Albrights settle in and teaches them how to survive in Alaska in the winter. However, the trick is not just surviving the elements, but surviving being in close quarters with each other all winter. With Ernst already being a bit volatile, the first winter is not easy. However, Ernst is forced to get a job far away at an oil refinery, so he's gone most of the time. It's at this time that Lenny, who has already grown close to her mother, grows closer to her mother. Lenny grows up pretty normal. Though school in Alaska is different from the school she'd been to, there weren't many people, and they tried their best to learn, but the winter months make it very difficult. As the book progresses, Ernst grows darker and darker. His neighbor Earl Harlan, the father of Bo, the man he saved, radicalizes Ernst, turning him essentially into a paranoid bunker man. Also, Lenny's mother, Cora, grows closer to one of the town leaders, Tom Walker, as Ernst builds a wall between the two of them. The drama in the town builds, putting Lenny's family on the opposite side of the argument from her new crush, Matthew Walker. Lenny's father doesn't like him, but he and Lenny end up having a relationship that ends with her being pregnant. That leads to what I call the first climax of the novel. Ernst has become a shell of a man, and he's both verbally and physically abusive. When he finds out Lenny is pregnant, he almost kills her, so instead Cora and Lenny kill him. and then they run. Now, this easily could have been where the book ends. However, this is not the end of our tale, and in fact, we get to my favorite part of the novel. Cora and Lenny go to Washington, where Cora's family lives. They're eventually taken in by Cora's parents. However, since Cora and Lenny are both wanted fugitives in Alaska, they have to change their name and get new paperwork made. Lenny has her baby, and Cora and Lenny make it work until they're able to move in with Cora's family. Although they had one run-in where the cops show up to investigate Cora's family, for the most part, their time in Washington was serene. Lenny goes to school and becomes a photographer and makes a living for her and her son doing this. Then it all comes crashing down when Cora discovers that she has terminal cancer. Caroline's passing was such a beautiful and heartbreaking moment in this book. She helps Lenny to move on. Then Lenny goes back to Alaska because she cannot leave that life. So her mother writes her a note saying she was guilty for all of it, so Lenny could return to be with Matthew. She just loves Matthew and would love for her son to know Matthew and his family. When Lenny arrives in Alaska, she goes to deliver the letter to the police chief, and he corners her and gets her to confess to helping with the crime. He then locks her up. However, Matthew's father, Tom, has become the governor, and once he hears about Lenny, he immediately gets her and her son out of jail. In her time away, Matthew has survived his tragic accident, and he's been pulling himself together. He struggles from many disabilities, but he knows enough to remember Lenny and her son. Their reunion, and both of them picking back the pieces of their life, was beautiful. Lenny knows she will always love Matthew, regardless of his state, and Matthew works hard to be a good father and spouse. This was such a touching tale of family, love, and the power of strong women. Unlike Hannah's other feminist histories, this tale was at the heart of it a love story. A love story between mother and daughter, a toxic love between Cora and Ernst, and the end of a marriage, and the love story between Matthew and Lenny. I love that each of these love stories were real. But before we dive into love, let's talk about characters. Instinctively, she lifted her camera and minimized her view of the world. It was how she managed her memories, how she processed the world in pictures with a camera. She could crop out and reframe her life. End quote. Lenny was such a lovable main character. She is genuine and maybe a little naive, but in a lovable way. Lenny grows up in an unstable home. Even though her mother cares for her, they struggle to provide for her, and so they move frequently. As we know, children who move frequently struggle to find themselves and are often withdrawn. Now, this isn't always the case, but is often the case, and it's kind of how Lenny is. She doesn't make many friends, but she finds solace in literature. Like many people who find themselves in stories, Lenny is a bit naive or fanciful. Now, there's nothing wrong with being fanciful, but it's often these people that are taken advantage of. And we see this throughout the novel. She wants to see the world like a story, but it's not how the world works. However, what I love about Lenny is even though her life is difficult, she doesn't give up. She's very resilient, and her ability to love and forgive and move on is such an amiable quality. She also loves Matthew, which is one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's something we'll talk about later. Cora is one of my favorite mothers from literature. Although Lenny wasn't exactly what she was planning for, Cora did her best to make Lenny's life happy. Cora was full of wisdom and kindness. Ernst and Cora must have been happy at some point in their marriage, and Cora sticks with him because she feels like it's the right thing to do. In fact, she says, "You don't stop loving a person when they hurt. You get stronger so they can lean on you." End quote. That might have worked for them in the beginning, but it's clear that Ernst is not getting better, regardless of how strong Cora and Lenny were for him. Cora teaches Lenny to see people for who they are on the inside and gives her much resilience and empathy. We will talk more about both Cora and Lenny when I discuss themes, but let's take a look at the other characters in the novel. Ernst was an interesting character. He falls into the trap of radicalism. Things in his life haven't been going well, and instead of doing retrospection and working to improve himself, he gets grumpy and blames everyone else around him for his behavior. It's not his fault that his life is bad. It's the people outside of him. The government is evil. My family can't do what I ask. The rich people are greedy, etc. We see a number of people like this throughout literature, and it's difficult to read these characters, but they do make excellent bad guys. They don't see themselves as bad, but they are trapped within themselves. In comparison to Ernst, we have Tom. Tom is a good man who's trying his best to make his part of Alaska a better place. He's kind and understanding, and even though he isn't perfect, he's trying. Tom hasn't had the easiest life either, and he even loses his wife. But instead of blaming others, he takes accountability for his situation and works to make his life a little bit better. Matthew is also an important part of the novel, but honestly, kind of a forgettable part of the novel. When I think back on this book, I just remember him as the boyfriend. However, he's worth talking about. He and Lenny become fast friends in a small town, and that's really important. Both Matthew and Lenny are outsiders compared to the others in Connect. Lenny because she's new, and Matthew because his father is rich. However, the two of them draw closer together, and eventually their relationship turns into a romantic one. In fact, it is in trying to save Lenny from a terrible fall in the mountains when he gets permanently injured for the rest of his life. I will discuss more about Matthew in just a minute. So let's move to themes. "I'm so lucky to have you, Lenny," Mama said, trying to organize her cards with one hand. "We're a team," Lenny said. "Peas in a pod, two of a kind." End quote. Lenny and Cora's relationship is my favorite part of this novel. Strong mother-daughter relationships seem to be a theme throughout Kristin Hannah's literature. But there is something special about these two. Although they didn't have it easy, Lenny and Cora lean on each other to survive in hard times. Cora ran away from home and dropped out of high school to marry Ernst. And while she never regrets these decisions, it's clear that sometimes Cora wishes she could do more for Lenny. As Ernst grows more unstable, Cora tries to shelter Lenny from the brunt of Ernst's anger. But like many women forced into that situation, she fails. In fact, Lenny has to call Tom to save her and her mother a few times in the novel. However, I do think that after Ernst is out of the picture, Lenny and Cora grow even closer. Having to rely on each other to survive in Alaska is one thing, but sharing the trauma of losing both a man they loved and feared, and then running from the police and starting all over, really brought the two of them together. I love this quote from near the end of the novel. "You have a child, so you know. You are my heart, baby girl. You are everything I did right. And I want you to know I would do it all again, every wonderful, terrible second of it. I would do years and years of it again for 1 minute with you." End quote. At the end of the novel, Cora writes a letter to the police saying she killed and buried Ernst all by herself, giving Lenny a chance at living the life she wanted. These two have always sacrificed everything for each other. Something I'm sure Cora had always felt a bit guilty about. So in her death, she's finally able to give Cora everything she needed. I love this quote from Lenny after losing Cora. Like all motherless girls, Lenny would become an emotional explorer, trying to uncover the lost part of her, the mother who carried and nurtured and loved her. Lenny would become both mother and child to her. Mama would still grow and age. She would never be gone, not as long as Lenny remembered her. The mother-daughter relationship in this book reminds us about the importance of our own mothers and the special bond between mothers and daughters. Mothers sacrifice everything for their children's happiness, and though it is difficult, I'm sure very few of us would say, yeah, I wouldn't do it. We would all choose to sacrifice again and again. The Great Alone is a semi-autobiographical novel because, like Lenny, Kristin's parents moved her to Alaska to become a homesteader in her early teens. The setting of this novel plays a large role in the plot. Cora having to keep her family alive and afloat after her husband decided to move them far, far away from civilization. The way that the town took care of each other because of the rough weather and so on. Here's a quote about Alaska that stood out to me. Alaska didn't create character, it revealed it. I think the setting of this novel helps to bring out people's true characters. It showed Lenny as being strong and capable, Cora as being brave, and Ernst as broken. I also loved how the community supported one another during the rough times in Alaska. Again, with Kristin Hannah, it is largely a community of women supporting other women, although Tom does help a significant amount as well. These people relied on each other for better or for worse. From this book, we learn a number of things about survival. That you shouldn't have to survive alone, that tough times bring out our true characters, and that survival is more than just physical, it's psychological as well. I, for one, am a big fan of when the setting of the novel plays an important role in the plot and themes of the book, and this is a great example of that. Throughout Kristin Hannah's novels, there have been a common theme, and that is the importance of stories and literature. We saw it in each of the novels we have looked into this month. So let's look at this quote from this book. Books are the mile markers of my life. Some people have family photos or home movies to record their pasts. I've got books, characters. For as long as I can remember, books have been my safe place. End quote. Again, in this book, stories are an important part of Lenny and Cora's life. Here's another quote that shows this. In literature, death was many things: a message, catharsis, retribution. There were deaths that came from a beating heart that stopped, and deaths of another kind, a choice made, like Frodo, going to the Grey Havens, death that made you cry, filled you with sadness. But in the best of her books, there was peace, too. Satisfaction, a sense of the story ending as it should. In real life, she saw it wasn't like that. It was sadness opening up inside of you, changing how you saw the world. End quote. Of course, as an English teacher, I love the emphasis on reading and how stories are what brings us together. Stories are such an important part of us. And lastly, the most prominent topic covered in this book is love. It starts with a love story and ends with a completely different type of love story. So let's start with Cora and Ernst. They were trapped by environment and finance, but mostly by the sick, twisted love that bound her parents together. End quote. These two were not a good fit. Both of them were thrown together more by desire than anything. Cora was lost, and Ernst gave her a place to be. However, Ernst needed help, and unfortunately, it was not the kind of help that Cora could give him. He needed to do some self-work, and he didn't. I did feel bad that Tom and Cora were never able to work things out. I do think they could have been a good couple, but with everything else going on, it just wasn't meant to be. On that note, let's talk about Matthew and Lenny. Here's a quote. "He taught her something new about friendship. It picked right up back where you left off, as if you hadn't been apart at all." End quote. These two understood each other and made each other better. I think they fit the trope of star-crossed lovers. Their fathers didn't get along, but against all odds, they ended up together. I love that these two started out as friends, and their friendship grows into a relationship. It's interesting to note that both Lenny and Matthew heal separately from each other. Matthew heals from the wounds he has taken alone and takes up painting to find himself again. Lenny has to heal from the trauma of almost seeing Matthew die and watching her father die, and also becoming a single parent. The two grew close together and then were torn apart. I think in many love stories, pairs are thrust together and find ways to heal together. However, these two did their healing separate, and they also both do their healing through art. Then they're able to come back together when they're ready. I'm not sure which is healthier, but I do think that this book shows us an important way to grow up and figure each other out before committing to each other. It was this healing that made them ready for the relationship that Eric and Cora were never able to have. I love this quote about the two of them. She needed Matthew, but not to save her or complete her or reinvent her. Her love for him was the clearest, cleanest, strongest emotion she'd ever felt. It was like opening your eyes or growing up, realizing that you had it in you to love like this forever, for all time, for all the time you had. End quote. Again, there are many lessons we learn about love in this book, but I think the most important lesson we learn is that you cannot fix or change someone else. You just have to accept and love them for who they are. Thank you for listening to this episode of According to Your English Teacher. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more book club ideas or book club updates. If you are listening to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and please leave the podcast a review. Your reviews help other people to find my content and help our community grow. If you want to know what books I'm currently reading, you can find me on Instagram or Goodreads. I try to keep those places updated with my current reads. Also, if you want to connect with me, you can send me an email at yet33@gmail.com. I'd like to leave you with one final quote. In the silence, Lenny wondered if one person could ever really save another, or if it was the kind of thing you had to do for yourself. Thank you for listening to this episode of According to Your English Teacher. This episode was written by me, Sam Gunther, and edited by Dallin Gunther. The music was done by Tom Brinton. Please join me next week as I review the books I read for September.